Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. In my presentation, I will be talking about digital public infrastructure safeguards, which is based on a project run by the United Nations, and I have had the pleasure of being chair of one of the working groups for the past year. And I think there are many things which are common with the current practices of deploying X-Road and with the recommendations and ideas which are provided from the DPI Safeguards project side. So the aim now is to take a look into what actually it means for X-Road to be a DPI. I'll be calling it briefly DPI from now on, so you know it stands for the Digital Public Infrastructure. What is the DPI Safeguards Framework about? And we also have had some presentations last year about X-Road and the ways how to deploy X-Road based on the collected feedback we have received from different countries. So I'm actually trying to combine some of the DPI safeguards recommendations with those of the X-Road feedback we have received and provide you some ideas for a successful X-Road deployment. Finally, I will show a few resources related to DPI safeguards, how you can actually get started with the framework. First, a few words about X-Road as a digital public infrastructure, DPI. X-Road is a free and open source data exchange solution. First of all, that's something which is related to the sustainability of X-Road. X-Road is available for any country, and the country which implements X-Road has full control over its DPI. And that's actually a big thing. X-Road does not cause a vendor lock-in, but it provides all the freedom of utilizing the DPI in the way its country wants to. Secondly, we can call it a DPI. Actually, X-Road is one of the most deployed DPIs worldwide. And finally, X-Road is a digital public good, which is recognized by the Digital Public Goods Alliance. So this is the current state of X-Road and how we look into X-Road as a DPI. So now what it matters for X-Road when we talk about DPI safeguards, sustainability of DPI. If we consider that today we have 24 ecosystems in the world, we have members from 159 countries in the X-Road community, and the community size being over 4,000. Congratulations and thank you for everyone for being part of it. And finally, X-Road is used in countries which count to 542 million people as the actual end users of the digital services in which X-Road is acting as the backbone. So it really matters how safe and how secure X-Road is from the point of view of a citizen, of a business, of any user of X-Road. Now, the Universal DPI Safeguards, it's a framework which was generated, led by the United Nations, Secretary General's Envoy on Technology Office and the United Nations Development Programme, UNDP. It's a result of a multi-stakeholder process or a project which collected people from the public and private sectors, civil society, development agencies, academia, and it included international organizations providing feedback for it, having 12 countries giving feedback, 13 convenings, over 100 contributors. And finally, we had the working groups of 43 people in total participating in the working group activities. Yeah, and what it consists of, the DPI Safeguards Framework, it took an approach of first thinking about the risks to be mitigated which are related to the DPI. It provided principles which are the kind of building blocks for any DPI to be safe and inclusive. And it considers the responsible authorities, so the organizations which are responsible for, first of all, deploying DPI, but also applying the safeguards, ensuring the DPI is safe for people. The approach taken in the project is a life cycle approach. It takes typical steps of any software deployment, basically, but it includes also some specific aspects related to how we want to focus more on the safety and inclusiveness of the DPI. And finally, last but not least, the framework provides recommendations over 300 processes and practices that can be followed in the deployment. So let's take a look first into the risks. So DPI safeguards is seeing privacy vulnerabilities, digital insecurity, physical insecurity, and lack of recourse as some of the key risks. Lack of recourse meaning that people should also have a possibility to redress, to mitigate the harms caused to them by the DPI. And the privacy vulnerabilities, digital insecurity, and physical insecurity are very typical topics for any DPI projects to consider. Risks to inclusion, discrimination, unequal access, exclusion, and disempowerment. As you can see, these are universal topics which are to be applied to different types of DPIs, not only X-Road, but also to solutions and services which are directly used by people. X-Road as a backbone has some similarities, some of the key points apply, but still there is a difference between each DPI, and that's why it's really universal. Also, structural vulnerabilities are seen in the context of the risks in this project. So it's about digital distrust, weak rule of law, weak institutions, technical shortcomings, and unsustainability. All of these are seen as risks for any DPI deployed anywhere in the world. Then there are the DPI safeguards principles. These are the foundational principles that should be seen applying to any kind of a DPI, that the DPI should do no harm, should not discriminate and exclude people and so on. And these are the building blocks for DPIs seen in the framework. It also includes operational principles, which are a bit different. These are for driving the continuous trust and adaptation of the DPI. And finally, it's about the iterative DPI lifecycle, which I mentioned in the beginning, how there is the phase of conception and scoping, then the strategy and design of the DPI, development for the custom purposes of deploying the DPI, finally the deployment itself, and then the operations and maintenance of the DPI. And this was one of the essential findings during the project, that we could see that the approach we have to take with any DPI is about the life cycle, not only about the deployment, after which a country would be left alone, but it's about the full life cycle and how we can make sustainable infrastructure also digitally. Now, let's take a look into the different stages of the DPI life cycle. And I'm providing some views on this also from the point of view of X-Road. But first, if we look into what the DPI safeguards is seeing in the conception and scoping, it might look very typical. So framing of the goals and objectives, going through some of the problems and challenges related to deploying DPI, and assessing its impact potential and so on. So typical phase of analysis and planning. With X-Road, we have some specific questions like the deployment models. X-Road can be deployed as a national data exchange layer. It can also be data exchange solution for regions. X-Road can also be data exchange within a business domain or sector, which actually has also happened. We have a few countries where X-Road is successfully deployed in that context. And it can also be a platform for data exchange within an organization. So it does not set any limitations, but this is part of the considerations in the very beginning. X-Road also requires establishing a vision and objectives. First of all, commitment to a data ecosystem. There is a big difference between a data ecosystem and just sharing data. And this is what we always repeat when we discuss with countries interested in X-Road. If you want to build an ecosystem, this is a solution for you. If you only need to exchange data, you have multiple options. Political support is quite often needed with X-Road, and it's also part of ensuring the DPI will remain sustainable in its use. Cross-sectoral collaboration is needed. There must be different stakeholders involved. And finally, keeping just the technology discussion out of the table can be beneficial, because it's not just about technology, it's about how we make change, how we deploy a solution for building a coherent ecosystem. Then we have some legal and regulatory considerations which are related to the rule of law aspects with the DPI safeguards. One interesting question is if X-Road is considered as one information system or several information systems, and if one security server is forming its own information system or if it is part of a larger information system. And this has been strangely a question which has been raised in some countries. What is actually the role of a security server and how we interpret it, even in the context of GDPR in Europe, for example. Free flow of data between public authorities, it's always the question that do we need contracts or should we have a law which is actually allowing for free data flows between the authorities. Existing legislation or new enhanced legislation, and there is the old saying that sometimes it could be easier to write a law than to write lots of code to overgo a problem. So it's a question about how we are approaching X-Road legally. Risk management with X-Road, that's also essential in the DPI safeguards context. And if we think about typical risks with X-Road, change management failures are a typical example. We might deploy X-Road otherwise successfully, but we might forget that actually it's all about people and we need change management for that. Project management issues, like with any IT project, could occur. We can have regulatory and compliance risks, training, knowledge transfer risks, vendor third-party issues, inadequate resources, political turbulence, the most terrible one. About the procurement, this is related to the previous one. We always say that it's best to turn to the X-Road technology partners because we know these companies have experience. And when we think about the procurement, we have to also consider the different levels what we need. Do we need a really high level of experience? Do we need experience in setting up the X-Road instances? Do we need lots of experience doing the integrations part? Well, it's a thing to consider in that stage of the deployment. And contract terms, here we have a point in which quite often training, knowledge transfer, support and localization could be forgotten. And we always want to remind that the feedback what we get is that it should be considered as part of the sustainable deployment, that actually already in the procurement stage, all of these would be considered and training and knowledge and documentation would be available through the life cycle of the DPI. As a reminder, our wonderful X-Road technology partners who are in the expo area, I hope you take the opportunity to discuss with some of them today. And you can later check from the X-Road website about the companies for more details. Yeah, and going back to the DPI lifecycle stage, strategy and design is seen as the next stage of the DPI safeguards. It's about mapping, engaging with stakeholders, getting to understand what is actually needed by individuals, by the society, identifying the parties which have some stake in there, raising awareness about the barriers to the implementation, and yeah, doing all of that. Well, if we look into the X-Road side and what it means, designing an ecosystem which is cohesive and functional, we often see that it's necessary to identify the so-called base registries, essential cross-usable services. As said, when X-Road is an ecosystem solution, it doesn't help if we have 100 different services in an ecosystem, of which none are actually cross-usable. The point is that when we get over, let's say, based on research, some 50 cross-usable services, we are already approaching the point when we get ecosystem benefits out of the X-Road ecosystem. Identifying the ecosystem participants is necessary, understanding who are actually the participants of the ecosystem, and in this stage, we should not forget the private sector. X-Road is not only for public administration, it's also for the private sector and all of the society, which is the way how we build sustainable DPIs. Design service processes. This is an essential part to ensure that everyone is feeling comfortable with onboarding, with getting certificates, getting support. So on this stage, designing the processes is essential thing with X-Road. About engaging with stakeholders, we have plenty of those. So with X-Road, we have service owners for the business process side. We have security server administrators for IT process, additional DevOps people working on X-Road, operational resources, information security, cyber security resources. We have plenty of associations in many countries that would also like to be involved in an ecosystem building. Finally, healthcare organizations and software vendors, which you could imagine would be a nice group to work with on X-Road, but it's its own world. Healthcare is quite regulated. It includes plenty of international standards, and open source solutions are not always most welcome there. But anyway, these are organizations we need to take into account and discuss with. The developer community is essential, meaning also the local one, that we involve the local developer resources in DPI deployments. Vendors, definitely, we need to build the vendor capacity locally with X-Road. So when deploying X-Road in a new country, it's necessary the local companies have business opportunities and have opportunities for learning. And this is where the knowledge transfer comes into the game as well. and procurement making it well, as said, and the legal side finally. So the number of stakeholders is really high. Now, when we consider the different stakeholders, we have to remember that there are value propositions for all ecosystem participants. And this is one tricky part of X-Road. If we ask an organization to set up a security server, the question is, what do we get of it if we are obligated to do so? So making all of the participants understand what are the benefits of the ecosystem, which overall is providing societal value and a sustainable long-term ecosystem for the society. But there are many aspects to consider. Society, ecosystem owner who is running it, ecosystem operator who is also essential here, user organizations, software integrators. So we have plenty of different groups, and we have to ensure each of these get something out of the ecosystem and understand the benefits. Finally, about the KPIs, which are also part of the DPI safeguards thinking to ensure the DPI is successfully deployed. We should set the KPIs. Here are some examples of KPIs we have seen with X-Road. It could be about the outreach and awareness in the X-Road system. It could be about user engagement and experience, where we can set KPIs, ecosystem growth metrics, if the goal really is, and as it should be, building an ecosystem. Operational efficiency metrics, for which we have tools, security and compliance, and then we also have scalability and adaptability. And actually, there's one thing more. There's the economic and cost metrics, for which we have an X-Road cost calculator to use as a tool when starting with deploying X-Road. But finally, making KPIs for the economic sustainability of X-Road in the long term is essential. You might notice that one KPI is missing here, and it is actually the KPI set for environmental sustainability. So X-Road provides also tools for calculating emissions of the ecosystem, and it's possible to set up even more environmental sustainability KPIs for X-Road, and this is one additional aspect I'm really stressing here. It just misses from my presentation, but it's something we consider every day. If we think about the development stage, what it means in the DPI safeguards context, it's about evaluating and selecting building blocks. In the context of X-Road, we could talk about selecting extensions, for example. Software coding, it could be some custom country-specific coding needs, setting up the API landscape and so on, whatever it's needed for actually starting to realize the DPI. Aspects from the X-Road point of view to consider, we have seen a few blocks like the requirements, what we actually need from the X-Road features, the architecture, what kind of environments are needed, what is the actual setup for our X-Road ecosystem, even in the stage of development of trying it out at first. And finally, the operations, the roles and responsibilities, and again stressing the need for smooth onboarding processes. We have always recommended proof of concepts with X-Road for a country which has not tried it yet. There are clear steps which can be taken to ensure it's going to be a sustainable deployment. If it works in a proof of concept, it's easy to go on. We recommend identifying some key stakeholders, business cases, expectations, starting to understand what we actually want to achieve with X-Road. After that, defining the scope of the proof of concept, picking some 2 to 4 services, which is already enough for trying it out. Then setting up X-Road, we can say it's a minimum viable X-Road, which is up and running for proof of concept purposes. Then trying it out, facilitating some data exchange, understanding how the management of the ecosystem actually works. It's not just about the data exchange, but understanding how do we manage our data ecosystem. And after that, it's about evaluating what we actually did, using some KPIs set for the proof of concept, understanding if the criteria and the expectations were fulfilled here. So this is the best way to get to know X-Road, to try it and not to write long reports on a paper. It doesn't help you. The data must be moving. So once you set it up, you know much more. And finally, it's possible to scale up. In the case the POC is successful, actually, you can start scaling it from there, or you can set it up again on different contexts. But anyway, it's a good start for X-Road journey. Deployment state of the DPI is about how we actually install, how we set up all the hardware, software, whatever is needed for that. This is the DPI safeguards definition of it. And when we think about planning the implementation, these are the typical questions we are seeing, considering the number of environments, identifying members, how we want to handle the evidence, like timestamping, signatures, logs, all that stuff. Security requirements for X-Road, high availability should be considered, again, monitoring, reporting. And that's not enough, because what we need is implementing effective governance for the project. What is essential for X-Road in our experience and getting the feedback from the actual implementation teams is that project owner should be powerful enough to really support and sponsor the project and give all the backing needed by the project team. So typically there is political backing, there is financing, there is organization and some key individual who is really in charge of the successful DPI deployment. The project team, that's the natural part we often jump to thinking about first, but actually there is one essential part missing. It is the change team. So actually applying a change management framework, something similar to ARCAD, for example, would be beneficial in any deployment of X-Road as well. Finally, once X-Road is deployed and any DPI is deployed, in the safeguards we are seeing some of the things which belong to this part of the life cycle, like monitoring, managing, maintaining, running the ecosystem effectively. If we think about the sustainability and evolution of X-Road, there are a few aspects: usability and user experience. User training and support should be available, how we handle with the maintenance, performance monitoring, security compliance, scalability, adaptability, disaster recovery and redundancy, cost management, budgeting, vendor relationships and management, stakeholder engagement and feedback, and so on. So it's plenty of aspects. And finally, environmental impact and energy consumption, which has been the key area for NIIS to work in regards to X-Road's ESG scope and sustainability. Finally, sharing with you a few links, because we got plenty of information and my aim is not that everyone got to read all of the details, but you can find a link to explore the Universal DPI Safeguards Framework, and it's a very useful tool when starting to deploy X-Road. You can utilize it in any DPI deployment and it's worth checking. You can read the guide about it, you can interact with the framework, it's open for feedback, open for comments, it's being developed constantly. And finally, you can deep dive engage with this initiative and community and get to see the Safeguards Resource Hub. So hopefully this provided some food for thought about how to deploy X-Road, how to do it in a sustainable manner, how to get benefit of the DPI safeguards, and this is what I wanted to deliver today. So thank you for listening.
Thank you, Ville, for your presentation. And we are getting questions from the audience. And while we wait for the question to come in, I'll have a couple of questions myself.
Okay.
We heard from Abi that it's not only about technology. And we have been discussing the importance also this morning when we opened the event, the importance of building communities. And X-Road has been very successful in building a very dynamic and very big ecosystem. Yeah. So what's the key of that success? What's the ecosystem managing model for X-Road?
Yeah, if we think about how X-Road has been growing, how the community has been growing, and what is the kind of success story behind it. Yeah, as a reminder, maybe some of the audience even don't know that when NIIS started working on X-Road and we got a handover of the existing user community, it was, I think, 80 people. And today we are over 4,000, so the growth has been huge. And how it actually started, I think the growth started from our plans to renew X-Road when we started working on the current version, X-Road 7 Unicorn. And we implemented some features which had been requested by the community for a long time, so we answered to the community's needs. And we built a clear value proposition from X-Road, what it gives you. And it was fully, I would say it was in interaction with the community, listening to what the people actually want to get. And this is the way how we got to grow the community. And this is also how X-Road got more and more deployed. If we would have remained on the same path like we were with X-Road 6, well, this would not have happened. But I think the community is essential, the power of co-creation, working together, openness, transparency, providing people access to the resources and access to backlog and everything we do. That's essential.
Absolutely, absolutely agree with that. And before passing on the questions from the audience, I'd like to ask you, you presented a set of recommendations for the deployment of X-Road, but if you had to choose one recommendation for organization to deploy X-Road, which one would that be?
My favorite recommendation would be to apply change management, to pick a solid change management framework and ensure that we are addressing the questions from all of the humans part of the project. People have some concerns. They are asking themselves, what does it mean for me? Why do we need it? Why do we take X-Road? Why don't we take something else? It's plenty of questions going around, and people need answers to these questions. And we need to be inclusive. We need to build community, build a group of these people who are actually running it, and to communicate more widely why we do it. So change management and addressing these kind of questions is essential for any DPI deployment, I think.
Thank you, Ville. I would have other questions, but in the meantime, I see 4 questions from the audience.
Okay.
So let's go into that, and I'll pick the most voted. One hurdle or challenge in the X-Road deployment, proof of concept or scalability, is always trust services. How can nations and/or technology partners include good trust services in an efficient manner?
To be honest, this is a question I would happily hand over to our Chief Technology Officer to answer. I don't have a good answer for that, and I want to be honest with that.
Absolutely. We'll have Petteri on stage later, and you have enough other questions, so we'll focus on other questions. And I'll go with the first one. If you had to compare DPI solution to COTS commercial solutions, especially for data transfer, what would be the major benefits over common commercial offerings?
Well, this is a typical question we have been handling in many events and meetings with people, that what's the difference of having an open source solution or having a proprietary solution? I don't think there is a need for really making a big difference between the categories. What I think there is software. Usually when we deploy something digitally, we have some software, and we have good software and we have bad software. Open source then is a licensing model or operating model for a specific DPI, where proprietary solutions or SaaS offerings can also provide very valuable tools. So I don't think we should look into it like as a black and white question. It's rather like we should pick the most sustainable solutions in the long term, understanding that it's good to use excellent software which is provided as proprietary software or SaaS offerings, but it's good to remember what it means on the other hand. So considering all the pros and cons of both worlds. Also, it's tricky when we say that open source is free, nothing is free. It's very expensive to deploy in many cases. So this is again a question that we have to very rationally approach and think about what it really means for us.
Thank you, Ville, for your answer. And let's go to the other 2 questions. When X-Road is deployed on a national level, which one is more common? To consider it as the one information system or several information systems?
I do not have an answer to which is more common, but I'm aware of countries having very different interpretations. In some countries, it might be a comprehensive legislation defining how the state-facilitated data exchange is taking place. And this could mean that it's also considered more as one large system. But based on my current understanding in Europe, if we look very strictly into GDPR and what it says, it might be causing a situation that each and every security server is read as its own information system. Mm-hmm. It's a bit of a technical, philosophical and legal question at once, so that's the case.
I see. And looking at the time, I want to jump to the next question. Yeah. Does DPI Safeguard have a permanent cooperation mechanism, or are they formed temporarily?
To my understanding, it now has been established and the framework has been released. And it's available for feedback, and the idea is that it's permanently maintained. And it's also updated, so it's not a static one, but it's being worked on all the time. And it's really open for feedback and participation from anyone who is willing to do that. So I recommend checking the website for details.
Thank you, Ville. And maybe we have some few seconds left for my last question, because we talked about India and we looked at data exchange solutions. So I've been wondering what is the strategy for X-Road scalability, and how is X-Road planning to collaborate with existing data exchange solutions already implemented?
Yeah, X-Road is said free for anyone to implement, and we have not been part of the implementation, so the software is provided and each country is picking it. And that's usually the point when we end up discussing something with the countries too. But if we think about X-Road's interoperability with different types of data ecosystems and data spaces, which is becoming the mainstream in Europe most likely. We aim to move on to the data space protocols for that purpose. Many things are still open in the world of data spaces as well. Like if we think about federating data spaces at the ecosystem level, similarly to like we have X-Road Trust Federation in place today, it's talked a lot. There are plans, but I do not believe we still know how to federate data spaces successfully. I think it's something which is still evolving. But I think the way which is leading there is that we all deploy the same protocols. We are based on the same standards, same protocols. We are increasing interoperability with these choices. And hopefully, in the future, we could also federate X-Road with other data ecosystems, not even data spaces, but any ecosystem which is deploying the same protocols and is fulfilling the same criteria with the standards and so on. So that's our long-term goal.
Yeah. And as Gaia-X and as a youth board of Gaia-X, yes. I'm sure that we can both agree on the need of interoperability. So thank you a lot, Ville, for your presentation.